Welcome back to part 2 of lecture 8 for NSCI 306. We're looking at strategies and techniques for doing online research. In the first half of this lecture, I looked at the research project more generally and suggested some ways to come up with topics and think about some of the processes that work through that long, difficult sometimes research process. I want to get more practical in this video, looking at some techniques for doing things like figuring out what search keywords to use. Those can be big ones and often make the difference between having good sources and having sometimes no sources at all. I also want to show you some of the resources we have available here at Cal State and some of the trade-offs in choosing which kinds of databases and such to use. My hope is that by the end you'll be able to start your research in earnest. So even if you haven't had any luck finding sources yet, you'll be able to use these in combination with the research handout and the readings to do that. So I will switch over to notes. Hope you had some coffee in our break. There we go. So to start off with, search keywords are basically the lifeblood of any effective online search. Google is getting generally smarter in that sometimes it can predict the kind of knowledge you're looking for rather than having to click through to a particular page. So for instance, if you go to Google and you type in, hours of Aldi, in Google's infinite wisdom, it will probably figure out what your location is. Thanks, Google. It will decide that you're probably looking for the hours relating to the Aldi grocery store. And in my case, it will pop up the one in Redlands and say, hey, Aldi is open until 8 o'clock or whatever it is. Now, that is helpful if you're just looking for information. It's not always as helpful if you are trying to find scholarship. And so the kind of stuff that you're working with here is going to work a little bit differently. So let me start with that aspect of finding keywords, because it's not always intuitive. We'll tell you a story, and this is not even in the before time. This is like in the late Jurassic. When I was in high school, we did actually have school back then. We even had computers, and I was taking a German culture class, and we had to do oral presentations. So I got mine out of the way pretty quickly because I wanted to get it done. I knew it would be a lot of work. And I absolutely positively had to get an A because, well, that's just how things were in my house. And so I think I did mine on a German author named Wolfgang Borchert. I remember nothing more about him now. It's been a number of years since that presentation. In any case, I was in the library one day shortly after that, and one of my classmates came up to me and she said, you did a really good job on your presentation. Can you help me find sources for mine? Because I can't find anything on the entire internet about this person. And I said, well, okay, who are you writing about? Of course, I don't remember exactly, but we'll just say Mozart for the sake of argument. And said, well, there should be like a bazillion sources on Mozart. This is even when the internet was very young. We had sources on Mozart. And so we walked over to this thing called a desktop computer. It's like a really heavy laptop with an ugly monitor. We sat down, and Google did not exist yet. So we pulled up this search engine called Alta Vista, or maybe Yahoo, or one of those other relics. And I said, okay, show me what you're typing into the search engine. And so she sat down and she typed in German culture and hit enter. And I said, I think I see your problem. There were lots and lots of results for German culture because it's the internet. A lot of people are writing about German culture or mentioning German culture or criticizing German culture or doing something that would cause German culture to come up in the search results. But there wasn't anything in the first page or two at least, specifically on Mozart. And so she was convinced that there wasn't anything on her topic. In that case, it was pretty straightforward. All we had to do was say, let's try, instead of just searching for German culture, let's put in Mozart. Said, wow, how did you know that? Well, that's kind of our starting point. I have seen a lot of students who have trouble finding sources or even deciding on a topic that they're interested in because they can't figure out how to manipulate the databases. And make no mistake, these databases are extensive, but they are just dumb computers. They are tools for you to use, and so you have to learn how to talk to them and get them to spit out the information that you need. It's a garbage in, garbage out system. So it will benefit you greatly to spend some time thinking about your keywords as you start your research process. Don't just dive right in, but spend even 15 or 30 minutes brainstorming. It's going to save you a lot of grief down the road and help you figure out how to move through your process. So I want you to start with your overall topic. As you saw from the sample research topics in the last lecture and from the sample papers on Blackboard, these are relatively narrow topics. And so there should be multiple things about that topic that you could potentially learn more about, particularly if you're starting big. So let's just say I want to learn more about teaching writing. Okay, well, like German culture, there are going to be a lot of articles and books and websites on teaching writing. And so I have to make a decision. How am I going to limit those? What elements of that pretty big topic do I want to know more about? What's going to be helpful to me? And so I have to start thinking about variables. Who am I teaching writing to? Is this to a particular type of student? Am I teaching at high school level? Am I teaching at college level? Am I teaching at a 2-year college or a 4-year college? Am I teaching at a private college or a public university? Am I teaching at a Hispanic serving institution like Cal State? Am I teaching at an HBCU? Am I teaching at sort of a generic school? Am I teaching at Harvard? Probably not. But all of those might make a difference in the kind of information I want to get at. Because a study that's done on first-year composition students in a private college in Massachusetts, it might have some useful insights on the writing process more generally. But if I'm really interested in teaching second language speakers whose main language is Arabic in a K-12 context, parts of that article are going to be completely useless to me. And so the first thing you have to figure out when you're deciding on keywords is, where's the gap? What are you interested in there? And of course, you can look at more than one thing for each topic. This is where Wikipedia can be really helpful. Yes, I said that in an actual college lecture. When you pull up the Wikipedia page, you will find, at least for the well-maintained ones, different sections on maybe big issues or controversies. You might find names of particular theories or approaches. You might even find citations. A lot of Wikipedia entries have a bibliography at the end. For now, focus on the actual words that they use to describe it. Because if you can figure out where that starts, that will give you something to plug in to the sources. And it can save you a lot of time to go through that. So this is the sample search. I'm going to be running this in the database a little bit later. But my sample research question is, what is the relationship between playing board games and Alzheimer's disease? And so I might grab something like this and do some sort of pre-writing exercise. I find that actually a mind map or a clustering exercise is helpful for this, just to kind of get my brain a little less rusty in figuring out potential connections and thinking about how might scholars have written about this? What terms might they use? Because particularly when you're starting to learn more about a topic, you don't speak the same dialect or language as the scholars, and that's okay. You want to figure out, though, what kind of terms are in play so that you can learn more about them and figure out, is this going to be an appropriate way to find better sources? So I might start here. Here are some concepts that potentially connect to my research question. Certainly board games, it's right there in the research question. Play, Alzheimer's, brain, or dementia. Now, I don't actually mention dementia, but my thinking is, okay, Alzheimer's disease is similar. It's a similar diagnosis to dementia. Sometimes they actually show up in the same patients or with very closely related symptoms. And so it's possible that a study of board games and dementia will help me with understanding board games and Alzheimer's more specifically. Now, even before we plug these into Google, and I'll test that a little bit later, you could probably guess that some of these are going to be more useful for isolating relevant information than others. If I put play or brain into Google, I'm going to get a lot of generally useless results. If I put Alzheimer's by itself, okay, I'm going to do a little better. I'll probably get some information about what it is. Probably the Alzheimer's Association will come up. Maybe I'll get a nice diagram of neurons disappearing in the brain. Maybe I'll even get some ideas for cures and treatments. They'll probably send me to maybe the Mayo Clinic page or something like that. That could be a good starting point. I could put in board games, and I would probably get a list of board games, and there will be all kinds of games. I'd probably get an ad. I would probably get, here are the best board games to play under quarantine, because that's the way Google is these days. But I wouldn't necessarily get anything helpful until I started combining keywords. And that's a big part of how the databases work. And I'll demo that for you a little bit later on. But even just in this case, you can see that you get a much narrower set and a much more useful set if you combine the phrases board games and Alzheimer's than if you just put one or the other in. So that would be the next step. Anytime you're starting a search, start with short search queries. Just that string of words you put in the search bar and hit enter. Later on, you can find ways to combine them. But you want to be concrete, so avoid abstract terms like compare or relationship. And you want to get as specific, eventually you want to get as specific as you can. And that's one of these trade-offs in the research process. You want to start big because you want to figure out what's out there, what are the key terms, what are people using, what are they writing about. But eventually you want to narrow that down to something that is specifically relevant to your work. So if you are researching treatments for a particular kind of lung cancer, it might help to start with ideas about, well, how does cancer work sort of in general? But at some point, you're definitely going to have to narrow that down to lung cancer, and you're probably going to have to narrow it down to that whatever kind or population you're looking at or whatever the variable is important there. A lot of my students, when they first start out the research process, they get really frustrated because they try to put their entire thesis or their entire research question just into Google, and Google doesn't work that way. Instead, pull out those key terms and put those in first. I remember just the other quarter, a student came to me before class, and I could tell he was frustrated. He'd been working on research proposals, and he said, I really want to look at how the community of Super Smash Brothers players works in terms of belief. And said, well, that sounds actually really interesting in terms of our course theme. But I can't find anything. No one has ever written on Super Smash Brothers. I guess it's just because it's a video game. And I asked the same question I asked my German culture classmate, what are you using for search keywords? And he was basically putting in that entire sentence, entire question. So let's start simple. So I pulled up Google Scholar, which I'll show you in a few minutes. And I typed in Super Smash Brothers. And you know what? Someone has written a dissertation on Super Smash Brothers and the playing community. Somebody had a lot of free time, apparently, but it's a thing. And even in a paper like this, if it's out there, then you can find some way to write about it. So don't overlook the simple, straightforward, kind of sledgehammer search keywords. You'll get to the specifics a little bit later. At some point, you'll hit a wall. And it might be the search results are way too broad to be helpful. It might be there are 3 million of them, and you don't have time for some reason to wade through 3 million results. I don't think any of us have that kind of time. And so it might help to think about synonyms, words that mean the same thing, but use different words, because scholars in particular don't necessarily talk about things in the same way that non-scholars and non-specialists do. And you've even seen that in the limited sample we've gotten of the Milgram article and the Wakefield article. And even there, you've certainly heard the term obedience before, but maybe destructive obedience was a new one for you. And unless you knew that term going in, it's kind of a catch-22. You got to know the term to be able to search for it. And it can get kind of frustrating to figure that out. So pulling up thesaurus.com can be actually really helpful to figure out what are other ways that you might talk about this concept, what other terms that are used. Even thinking about antonyms, the opposites, can help you identify terms. Actually, thesaurus.com will do that for you as well. You also want to keep tabs on abbreviations used in your field. And this is especially helpful the more technical fields, because they're really, really, really long words. I know, because I have to read and edit all of them. At some point, spell check just gives up. It's like that's totally not a word. Come on. But nobody else wants to try to spell them, especially the researcher who is trying to figure out English as his third language and has to write this whole journal article in English. And so they're going to be abbreviations. Some of them you may have come across in other contexts. ESL for English as a second language is pretty common. But others, like in scholarship on ESL education, you might come across this abbreviation L2. And if you're a scholar in that field, you'd see that and say, oh, of course, L2 means second language. It means the language to learn second. But it wouldn't mean anything to a non-specialist. And so hopefully the authors, if they have done their job, or if their editors have done their jobs, they will define those terms for you. But especially in the titles, they're not often going to do that. So make note of those. Sometimes they show up in search keywords, and sometimes you got to figure out how those actually play out. Keywords are going to be such a big part of your search process, not just in finding results, but in kind of drawing connections between them. I had one particular instance when I was doing my dissertation research where I had a concept in mind. I had observed it, and I was pretty sure I had seen it somewhere else. But I saw this kind of working in the novel I was writing about, and I could not for the life of me think what the word was for it. And I tried all these different combinations, and I was trying to figure out what can it relate to, what are the synonyms, and I didn't really know enough about it to even get that far. And I was really frustrated, because this was going to be like the centerpiece of my argument. And finally, I gave up. I sent an email out to a listserv of other scholars in my field. I said, okay, I may be crazy here, but I think there's this thing. Let me tell you about it. Does this sound like a real concept to anybody, or am I just completely making stuff up because I haven't had any sleep in 5 years? And within about 10 minutes, one of my colleagues had written back and said, oh, that's supersessionism. I thought, oh, that's not a real word. Come on, supersession, that's not, well, I plugged it into Google Scholar. Turns out it's a real word. And so I was able to add that to my other search queries to find it in other articles, to figure out what had been done on my novel in terms of supersessionism. It turns out nothing, which was good for me because I could write about it. And I would have saved myself so much time and so much trouble if 2 weeks earlier I just said, you know what, I don't know what this word is. I'm going to ask somebody. So please don't be as stubborn as I am. As you structure your searches, you're going to find that different databases and different engines behave in different ways. And that's just the nature of the beast. They organize data differently. They will draw from many different kinds of sources. Google and Google Scholar are going to get different kinds of results, as I'll demonstrate in a few minutes. And they're going to be working with different kinds of fields. And that's a useful thing to know, because a database field is a box. It puts certain information in that box. And so when you go to organize that, you've got to figure out, is this keyword going to show up in author, in title, in the full text somewhere? Because each of those could be more or less precise. And how's this going to help me search? So, visual aid. I have my bookshelves behind me, and I have not actually organized this by Dewey Decimal System. I apologize to all the librarians who are shocked. But I do have the middle bookshelf. The big one is fiction, and the two on either side are nonfiction, because I have a lot more nonfiction books. Most of my fiction is on my Kindle now. So if I want to find a specific book that I know I have, then I really only have those two categories to work from. I have to know, is this fiction or nonfiction, before I know roughly where in the room to search for it. Now, I only have three shelves, so it's not a big search process. I can probably look over every single title if I have to before I find it. And so I've also tried to do some rough organization. So on one of my nonfiction shelves, I have all of my editing books together, or my reference books. I have all my books on Scrabble and checkers and chess together. I have some books, like in my fiction shelf, all my antique books are on the top shelf. All of my Norton Critical editions are on the shelf together. So if I know more about the book, I can find it there. 3 shelves, it's easy. 3 million shelves, it's a little bit harder. So the more details you can find, the better you can figure out how to organize that in the database. And I'll demo that a little bit later on. I suggested earlier that you start with shorter keywords. And that's because just a fact of how the databases work, the longer the query, the fewer results you'll get. Eventually, this will be a good thing, because you want to find stuff that you can actually manage and potentially read through and use in your paper. But to get there, it has to be a precise enough search term that is actually going to be helpful or useful for you in some way. One of the tasks I do often in editing is double check bibliographic citations. So at the end of the paper there, the references the works cited page. And so I will generally just copy the name of the article and stick it into Google Scholar. Ideally, what I want is exactly one result, because that tells me, hopefully, that I found the same result that my client is trying to cite. And then I can double check maybe the spelling of the author's name, or I can convert it from the format they have to the format that the journal or the publisher wants. And so I want exactly one there. Occasionally, I can't find that exact one. And so I have to think about keywords. And so I might pull out 2 or 3 terms from the title and the author's name and hope that I get lucky. And sometimes I find the stuff that I want, and sometimes I don't. It depends on whether it's been indexed. And I have to chase it down in other places. That's where my job gets fun. One of the useful aspects of search engines is the chance to limit those behaviors. So you could say, you know what, I only want to look in title. I don't care if something else uses this keyword in some random place. So if I want to find sources on chess, and I only want stuff with chess in the title, like how to play chess, or chess for dummies, or how have you not figured out chess yet, you moron? I don't think that last one is real. I might want to put it there, because if I put it in the full text, I could get some random thing where the 2 characters played chess, and then they went off to fight the aliens, which is perhaps interesting, but not at all the kind of book that I'm looking for. In your paper, you need to find sources published in the last 10 years. So I will show you how to limit that search in Google Scholar, as well as EBSCO databases, Academic Search Complete in our example. As you start finding sources or potential sources, please, please, please use bookmarks. Some of the databases have tools built in where you can save the material to a folder, where you can email it to yourself. I used to do that all the time, just putting stuff in an email. Now I have it in my Gmail. I still have it because, I mean, why would you delete anything from Gmail? It has like 18 bazillion gigabytes or something. I do that for two reasons. One, because I'm never quite sure which sources I'm going to use until I'm actually writing the paper. And so I want to find stuff that could be useful. And two, because I have had far too many students come into class and say, oh, I found this really great source that I want to use for my paper. I say, great, let me see it. I say, okay, so let's see. I think I used Google and I typed in the quick brown fox. No, it was the brown quick fox. Or was it Academic Search Complete? No, it was YouTube. It was definitely on YouTube. It was this database documentary on they never find the source. They never, ever find the source. We have effectively infinite storage, especially for text. You can put the complete works of Shakespeare on an ancient 256 meg thumb drive and have lots and lots of room to spare. So, hit that bookmark button. Email that to yourself. Save that PDF, put it on a thumb drive or on Dropbox or in your email, wherever you can find it again, because you will need it at some point. I'm always surprised at how I can manage to find stuff that I pulled up once, 5 or 6 years ago, because I decided, you know what, maybe I'll just keep a copy here. I had a student who took my class in 2014, and she'd asked for a recommendation letter, which I wrote her then. And she messaged me on LinkedIn like last week and said, I don't know if you remember me, but can you write me another recommendation letter? And said, you know what? I bet I still have it. I had the letter from 2014, 2015. And so I said, here's what I have so far. If this will work, we can just change a couple of details, send it off, and you'll be good to go. Saved me a lot of time because I remembered her name, but I would have had to look up all the other details that I used the first time through to write the letter. So bookmarks for the win. That takes me to the related question of organizing the material that you find. And there are some useful tools for this. I strongly suggest that you keep your notes together. So if you are the type that wants to keep track of everything in a notebook or in some other form of paper, put them in a binder. When I was teaching on campus, I had a big honking plastic binder. I kept all of my syllabi, all the homework I had to hand back, copies of the assignments, handouts, all that stuff in there, because I knew at some point I would need that. And it was a point of pride that I would at least have all that stuff to hand back to students. In fact, at one point, I got rather upset because I'd given my students, I think it was like an in-class writing assignment, just a little 5-point thing. And I went to hand it back the next class day. And one of my students came up to me and said, my paper wasn't in the stack. I know I did it. I was like, I know you did it too. You were here. Let me see if I can find it. Maybe I put it in the wrong pocket or the wrong folder. I looked through my entire binder and it wasn't there. I said, oh, okay, I really don't know where else it'd be, but give me a couple of days. I'm going to go back home. I'm going to look at all my other stacks because I might have other grading. I put it in the wrong place. I went through every piece of paper I could find. It was not there anywhere. I was like, how did I manage to lose this paper? I can't even blame my cats. I don't have cats anymore. What happened to the paper? And, ultimately I was just like, this is really frustrating, but I can't do anything about it. So, I just gave the student full credit for the exercise and moved on. And it was 3 weeks later that another student came up to me and said, I'm really sorry, but I was going through my papers and I realized that I picked up the wrong paper like 3 weeks ago. Guess what? It was the paper I couldn't find anywhere else. So I gave it back to the real owner and made a mental note to double check that next time a paper goes missing. So this is not a foolproof system. but it is a good step, especially if you are not a naturally organized or tidy person like me. If you're organizing stuff on the computer, the same principles apply. Put your PDF sources in the same place, and please, as you download them, give them useful file names, because databases store things generally as a string of numbers. And unless you can happen to remember that 8675309.pdf is the article about Jenny, then you're going to have trouble finding that later when you actually need it. There are some tools for you. EasyBib you may have come across before. It's not great as a citation generator, but it will help you keep track of bibliography. Zotero is another good option. We actually have workshops in the library to use Zotero. It's free. It has an extension for at least Firefox, Safari, and Chrome. And our library also has other tools that can help. I recommend scanning or photographing notes just so you can have them and store them somewhere. People spill coffee. People lose papers. Sometimes other people lose other people's papers accidentally. I use often the Google Drive app for this. It's basically you take a picture and it converts it to a PDF, uploads it to Google for you. But your printer may have a scanner built in, or you can even just take photos. I still have photos that I took on a research trip to the Lew Wallace Museum. Lew Wallace wrote the novel Ben-Hur, which I was writing about for my dissertation about supersessionism. And I was able to get access to the author's actual library, like the same books he referred to and marked up when he was writing the novel. It's really cool for a nerd like me. And I just spent the whole time taking photos. I would zoom in on notes he made in the margins. I would take note of the titles that he saved, of the connections that he drew. And I was able to integrate that into my argument. Say, in this particular volume, he made this note, and this shows up in this important place in this novel. No one else could do that without access to that particular book. So it's a really useful tool. And I've got more photos than I possibly could use in that one chapter. So I might go back and say, what else can I find in there that I could write about? That way I don't have to drive back to Crawfordsville, Indiana, which is a bit of a trip from Southern California. Lastly, if you have major sources that you're going to use, stuff that is particularly relevant for your work, mark them up. I find it helpful to print them and use one of the ridiculous number of highlighters and markers and pens that I have that I would never otherwise use. See, I've got 2 stacks of them right there. There's something about the physical, tactile sensation of doing that I find helpful. But there are programs to mark up PDFs. If you have an iPad, I believe there's an app that's native there that will do that nicely for you. Whatever it takes to organize the information and remind yourself what you're going to do is a good thing. So now you have your sources, you've found them, you've organized them, and you have to decide, is this appropriate for the project that I have in mind? And the more specialized your projects, the tougher that is going to get, because you need something to be more on target than just I have 5 sources that sort of mention my paper topic. So I want to go through a few ways of evaluating those sources before I look at the actual databases that we have. So we're going to start with reliability. I mentioned in my lecture on reading scholarship that the sources you find in databases, particularly the academic journals, they go through a lot more work in terms of peer review and revision than online sources. There are still mistakes that make it to print. There are definitely misreadings or misrepresentations. We saw that with the Wakefield example, that sometimes information comes out later that said, let's retract this. It's not reliable. So rather than say only use print or PDF sources or only use websites, I would say be careful about how you use both of them. Don't assume that either one is automatically reliable or automatically not reliable. I actually had a professor in grad school, was on my dissertation committee, brilliant scholar. but he was not a fan of any sort of online sources at all. And so every time I would cite something using a website in my dissertation, and it was stuff like, here's a little historical detail where the website was the best source that I found for it. He would circle it and write, find another source. Kind of, get off my lawn while you're at it. You also want to think about how much time has elapsed between the primary text, like the event or the data, and the secondary text. And a good case study of this is news events. When something big happens, especially if it's a tragedy of some sort or kind of a high profile court case, then details are very sketchy at first. We live in an era of Twitter. Twitter is basically terrible, but it has a lot of information. And so you might get a lot of conflicting data at first. As time goes on, hopefully there's more fact checking, more perspectives come into that. Again, take a look at the video I looked into earlier on popular versus scholarly sources. It gives you a good sense of what they call the information cycle. So I recommend that to you. If your article does not cite anything else, or if it only cites older stuff, then that's a giant red flag. Part of being a good scholar is keeping up on what has been done, not only overall, but especially recently. There were several sources that were sort of relevant to my dissertation work that I just didn't cite because they were published in the 1960s. And it seems kind of cruel to say, well, you're only relevant if you were published after 2000, but that's just kind of how the game is played. I remember doing initial literature reviews for a proposal, and my professor told me, you can't use anything that was published before 2000 at all. It was really hard to find all the sources, got to redo a bunch of my searches there. But it is an important part of recent scholarship, and that's one reason why I have you look at stuff published in the last 10 years for this paper. A couple of checklists for you. UNR Libraries has a good checklist. They talk about accuracy or quality, authority, purpose or stance, coverage, currency, and relevance. And you see different versions of that coming up at different sites. My favorites are the ones that label this the CRAP checklist: coverage, relevance, accuracy, and purpose. Because as you research, you're going to find a lot of crap. Most of it lives it up to its name. There's another one at CSU Chico if you want to stay a little bit closer to home. Second thing you want to evaluate then is the relevance of that work. Remember, this is your paper. I want you to find sources that help you advance your argument. In this case, the argument looks a little bit differently in paper 2. But choose the ones that are going to help you move that argument forward. There's lots of good information about lots of cool things in the databases and books on the web. Most of it you will not be able to use in your paper. Kind of sucks, but that's how it is. You do not have infinite words to fill. So go back to the beam model that I shared earlier and think about, what are you doing for each of these sections? What is the purpose of this part of your argument? If you are setting up a history paper, you may want to start with more of a background source. If you're analyzing a novel, it might make more sense to start with a method source. In your main analysis in your body paragraphs, probably argument sources are going to be most helpful. But there's no hard and fast rule. You must use this type in this paragraph. So you will then want to ask a couple of important questions. First, is this going to persuade your audience? You know from your own experience that some people and some groups and some populations will respond differently to different kinds of evidence. For some people, it's all about the numbers. For others, it's, well, what about this personal story? Or what about this interview? For some, it's, okay, enough words, I want a song, or I want a picture, I want a movie, something like that. It's going to persuade them in different ways. We've recently had a rash of social media posts about this pseudo-documentary called Plandemic. And it's very rhetorically smart. The content's absolute nonsense, but it's rhetorically smart. It plays into the methods and the approaches that people who would tend to agree with the authors already think that way. So it uses a lot of implications. It uses a lot of dramatic narratives. It uses a lot of conspiracies. And so if you're going after a group that's going to respond well to that, then that works fine. Conversely, the posts that are debunking and challenging pandemic, of which fortunately there are several floating around now, are much heavier on facts. They're like, here is the specific scientific study that debunks this particular point. Here's how this process actually works, contrary to what is said in there. Here's what really happened to this individual person. And if you want access to any of those, I would be more than glad to give you the link. Just send me an email and I'll pass it along to you. In an academic context, you might have a different set of evidence requirements. In this paper, I'm asking you to cite 5 journal articles. Other professors might say, find me a YouTube video that does this particular thing well. Find me an advertisement. I teach an assignment like that in 107 as well. This is part of knowing your context and knowing your audience. So we're going back again to the basic rhetorical appeal so we looked at a few weeks ago. Finally, when you're evaluating relevance, you want to think about something that this contributes to your paper, something unique. Is this new information? Is this a perspective, some sort of content that you don't get anywhere else? Is this maybe using a method you haven't seen in your other sources? Is this examining a data context, a population, a variable that is helpful for you? And you gotta be ruthless here. You gotta ask, how does it do that? And why is this particularly helpful here? Because you don't have room to cover everything. You certainly don't have time to read everything that is potentially tangentially related to your paper. And the third R, because alliteration is awesome, is rigor. This is basically the strength of the argument. So you've had a chance to look at this in several different contexts, including our discussion today about Bauman and Milgram's respective arguments. So how strong is this? How would you evaluate the claim, maybe in a peer workshop context? Does it seem like this is a really obvious point to make? Is it like, this doesn't really seem to work? Does it seem just to be screaming, hey, I'm biased for this one side? And you had some practice looking at those factors in your paper 1 drafts. As I suggested before, part of being a good scholar is to deal with other people's arguments. So you want to find those that directly engage others. They may disagree with every single thing that's ever been written on this topic before. Doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean they're right. But it means that they should be able to make those arguments, to say that here's what others have said, and here's how I'm approaching this issue. So this is why I think it's going to be more helpful to do this approach. And you can do the same thing as you go. Look for potential agreement, potential disagreement, or opportunities to do both. You're not so much doing that in paper 2, but you do a lot of that in your response papers. And that can be a good skill to pick up, especially with longer research projects if you're looking forward to a thesis level in the next year or so. Lastly, you can evaluate the source rhetorically. We've looked at 3 of these appeals already, ethos, logos, and pathos. Kairos, I've alluded to, we didn't really cover a lot of that. Kairos is about timeliness. It's about, is this a good time to make this claim? So Stanley Milgram does this when he says that we've seen 15 years ago that Nazi Germany had this certain model of destructive obedience, and it had these devastatingly tragic effects. We need to know more about this topic. All right, I'm going to move on then to the databases to show you how some of these work. I'm going to use my sample search I mentioned a while back on board games and Alzheimer's disease. I'll show you some of the pros and cons of using these, as well as some of the tools that will be helpful for you. So I'll switch over there. And We'll start with our old friend, Google. Getting distressingly smarter. And we're going to type in board games and Alzheimer's, which, yes, I've searched it here before. All right. We have games they want to sell us that are theoretically good for dementia and Alzheimer's. Notice the sponsored link up here, and then we can scroll through. We've got the End of Alzheimer's audiobook, Quirkle, of course. Alzheimer's awareness personal checks, nothing at all to do with my topic. The PBS Frank Lloyd Wright memory game, probably not particularly helpful either, but Google wants to sell me stuff. That's what Google does. One of the downsides of playing like this. So let's instead move on to the top result, and you notice they have a little call-out box. They recommend that's probably the most relevant one here. Sometimes it's hit and miss. So let's pull through this one and see what kind of source this is. And we have, this appears to be Eastleigh Care Homes, which I think is a nursing home in Great Britain. You can go through this. Yeah, it looks that way here. Nursing care, dementia care. 10 board games you can play with dementia patients. Now, just browsing through this, I've seen a lot of text, but I'm seeing no citations. No one is dealing with other scholars. There doesn't seem to be a lot of direct analysis. They do mention games. Here's bingo. Okay. Snakes and ladders. That's a fun game, I guess. Drafts, checkers. Uno. Okay, I'm with Uno. Uno's a great game. But they actually argue that we should avoid complex games of strategy because they will confuse and cause bewilderment, potentially highlighting what they can't do rather than what they can. Actually, I'm making the opposite argument in this imaginary research paper, that board games of strategy can actually help this. So overall, there's some information here, but it doesn't seem to be particularly authoritative, and it's certainly not scholarly. But Google says this was the first one here, and it came up because we have games for adults with dementia. Remember I said earlier that Alzheimer's and dementia are similar concepts here, and games does come up in the text there. Swing and a miss, Google. As we keep going, we can look at other titles. So here we have games for dementia and Alzheimer's patients. www.alzstore.com. I bet you they want to sell me something. Look at that. They do. Could be potentially useful, but not so much if I want to know the academic research behind this. This is another storefront. So I'm going to move on. Now, this is where the experience comes in handy. I see this URL, ncbi.nlm.nih.gov. I have to know the NIH is a reliable source. So I'm going to click through here and see what this is. Playing board games, cognitive decline, and dementia. A French population-based cohort study by about 8 authors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, this is definitely a scholarly source. U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health. We have an abstract. We have an article summary. Ooh, I like this already. We get all the cool quotes. Strike limitations. We have citations. We have footnotes. We have references to all these others. Oh, I like this. We have tables and charts. Okay, I'm putting this towards the top of my list of potential sources on board games and Alzheimer's. Now, it may not be specifically relevant to the kind of argument I want to make. Depends on how I end up analyzing that data. Because this does have a specific setting, a specific kind of participant, and this evaluates, looks like the the risk of dementia developing. They don't actually say development in their title, but that's what shows up in the abstract. So it may be that I want to look at treatments. I might say, if there are symptoms of dementia or Alzheimer's, would playing board games help? This study would not specifically tell me that. What it could tell me was that here is the pattern of people who played board games versus did not play board games, and here's what happened to them in terms of this particular diagnosis. That could be helpful, but it's a distinct research question from the one I want to ask. So I would likely want to save this, and looks like there's some options there. I can set up a link with Google, which I'm not going to do right now. Simplest thing would be, of course, just to bookmark this and go on to the next one. So we got pretty lucky. This is source number 3 in the Google results. And to keep going, it looks like there's a mix of things trying to sell me games. Got some related searches here. It's just a useful tool sometimes. Here's an article from tabletopgaming.co.uk. Yes. Aw, chess and Up, I think. I forget exactly which Pixar movie that's from. This is a report on a scientific study. The study by U.S. researchers at the Mayo Clinic. This is similar to the stuff you looked at for paper 1. And I might actually be able to click through and see if this comes up. Hey, look at that, another academic study, and it says free. I have a PDF. That's 2 sources right there that can be potentially useful. And this one actually does not mention board games in the title. I would not have found this if it were not for investigating the other source and clicking through. So one source took me right to the academic paper here, but the other one was a non-academic paper that eventually led me there. Read both of them. The rest of these mostly are journalism, or here's a Pinterest board, not particularly helpful here, and here, more dementia puzzles books. All right, so Google did okay. It showed us that there are some articles out there and that there's some popular interests, there's some popular sources about this topic. So we're going to grab the same search result. We're going to go to Google Scholar, my favorite, scholar.google.com right here. And we're going to put the same thing in and see what we find. Okay. Well, I recognize this one. We just looked at this one. Playing board game, cognitive decline, and dementia. We also have comparison of neurodegenerative pathology in transgenic mice overexpressing V717F beta amyloid precursor protein and Alzheimer's disease. Just because I'm a glutton for punishment, I'll click through this neuroscience and search for board games 0. So you can tell by the annoying chime. So this doesn't have anything to do with board games, but something in the Google Scholar algorithm came up. Oh, look, games. It's a false positive. Same thing up here. The person named Games. Here we have a Washington Post article. Might help there. And there are some other potential sources here. But even though Google Scholar, of course, focuses on scholarly articles and has very impressive journals come up, a lot of this is less relevant than we found in Google. Really, it's just this one here that we already knew about. But while I'm here, let me show you a couple of tools. So we're going to take this as an example. Great option here. Let's start up here. So I mentioned you could limit sources here. We're going to take from under date here, custom range, and I want to tell it 2010 to 2020. And I get down to 8,020 results from about 13,000. So that's pretty good. This one is still on there because it was 2013. I can sort them by date. And I think I have to redo this one. It's a little annoying. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that exactly, but Google Scholar has some weirdness to it. The other couple things I want to show you. First, you find your article that you might want to cite. You can save it here, save to my library and, of course, my Google account. Click the quote button. Look at that, citations. These are pretty reliable citations too. I can tell you as an editor. Occasionally they'll miss a punctuation mark here or there, so you want to double check the format against your style guide. But it gets some good information. Here's MLA, here's APA, copy paste, you got your works cited page. The other really cool thing is the cited by tool. So this has 52 citations. This tells you it was somewhat popular, but probably not outside of specialists. We can click through and get links for all 52. Now, not all of them have full text. These have full text on the side here. But let's say I found this one, and I thought, wow, that's exactly what I want to look for. I click cited by, and chances are good that the people citing this have similar interests. So they might also write something that I'm interested in, and they're all going to be newer, obviously, because they're citing the material. And so if this one's after 2010, which it is, then I know the rest of them are. So I've got 52 results. I might find all 5 for this particular assignment in there. You can also do, sometimes there are different versions that show up. Sometimes one is published online or in different journals here. You can see like this is at the publisher, this is from ResearchGate, Semantic Scholar, ProQuest. This is all the same article. So it's basically a matter of deciding which one you want to cite. And these are useful full text links there. And you can also do related articles here. So this is not necessarily cited in, but we've already seen some similar studies. So here is the impacts of Go. Okay, Go is not Chinese chess. Silly authors, silly authors. I don't know why they translated it that way. On Alzheimer's disease in a Northeast Chinese population. Now I'm really curious about this. I want to see what this is. Yes, yes, yes. Go. Oh, a kind of Chinese chesses. All right, and this person needs to hire me to copy edit this. But how we actually have, okay, so this is Go. This is a different game than chess and a different game than Chinese chess, Shanghi. But that is slightly beside the point. See all the fun stuff you can learn in doing research. All right, so that takes care of 2 of our databases. There's some useful tools in both of these. Let me take you then to Academic Search Complete. This is in the EBSCO databases. EBSCO is just the database host. So you'll see this logo for a lot of different databases. In fact, you can see here, searching Academic Search Premier, but I can choose different databases here. And we have a whole bunch of them. It's taking a little while to load so many that we have. This might have been a mistake. Yeah, let's go back. All right. Take us back through here. Uh-oh. And it's going to be annoying. 1 second. Let me fix this. Try this again. Okay, there we go. We're back. I'm not going to click Choose Databases, but you could if you wanted to crash your computer. First thing I'm going to do, though, is to go to Advanced Search, because this looks just like Google. It's going to search everything. Advanced Search is going to let me search specific fields. So I can pull this down, and this is going to be different for every database, and say, I just want title, or I just want subject terms. I can even say, I just want people involved. We're going to stick with subject terms for now. Do board games as a subject, and we'll leave this in selected field, which is just all text by default. Let's see what we have. We have one source, which doesn't really seem to be particularly scholarly. It's from Good Housekeeping magazine. Not quite the academic journal I was hoping for, which means I've gone too narrow. It's probably this problem here, the subject terms here. So let me try title, see if that helps. No results for board games and Alzheimer's in the title. All right, we're going to back all the way off and do full text. See what we have. We have 15. And some of them do look like potentially scholarly sources. This is from 2003, so a little too old for this paper, but leisure activities and the risk of dementia in the elderly. Good Journal of Medicine, okay. The behavioral outcomes of a technology supported leisure activity people with dementia. Possibly, but I'd have to look in to see what they actually do. And not a whole lot else that is going to give me the kind of analysis that I found on Google. Here's one about a hockey player. I honestly don't know why this came up at all. So academic search from here is not foolproof. We can come up here and limit this to scholarly peer-reviewed journals. This is a very useful checkbox. And we go from 15 to 9. It might help to do it all in one. Let's try that. We're down to 3. Okay. So in this particular case, Google actually gave us much better results than Google Scholar or Academic Search Premier. Now, of course, I've done this search before. I knew what was coming here. But I use this example to encourage you to use multiple sources to find them and to kind of organize what you have here. Before I sign off, let me show you some useful tools here in the EBSCO interface. See up here, we have a folder. This is where you can save citations. So right now I haven't saved anything. But if I go back here, notice the little folder plus. Click there, and now it's in my folder. Look at that. Leisure activities and the risk of dementia. If I were to sign up here, I could do that. But I could also just send this to myself. So let's click through here. And you'll see an overview, including useful subject terms. Some of these, they actually like hashtags, so they index information. I can click through and find out what else would be important about for dementia prevention. And that might actually help me find more stuff. So if I do there, let's see if anything comes up here. Yeah, it's still not great, but maybe I get more specific. Maybe it's not board games, maybe it's chess. Ooh, why cognitive training in brain games will not prevent or forestall dementia. That might be useful. I'd probably disagree with it, but it might be useful. So if we go back here, see on the side here, all these ways to share this. You can save it, you can print it, you can, this says remove from folder because I already added to the folder. See here, you can cite it here as well. ABNT, I don't even know what that is, but AMA, American Medical Association, APA's there, Chicago, Turabian, MLA's here. You can grab those and stick them in a document somewhere. You can email this to yourself. You don't have to be logged in necessarily to do this. So I like doing this with the citation up front. And in this case, I don't think we have a full text, but if we did, then there would be an option to attach the PDF file with it. That's very helpful. See if we have any with full text. No, okay, you know what? I'm gonna find stuff where we have it. We're just gonna do board games. All right, full text, board games, scholarly peer-reviewed journals. A review of 5 African board games. Is there any educational potential? So if we were to go through this one and then go to email, yeah, you see this checkbox, PDF as separate attachment, HTML full text. Good way to have that on hand as well. So there's actually a lot you can do with these engines. I do want to, actually, before I go, I want to show you a couple things on the library page. So just so you know how to navigate this, you'll be reading a few sources from this for today's class. But a couple things to highlight. Obviously, the library's shelves are closed right now, but services are still active here. The find button is going to be helpful here. Honestly, OneSearch is not that helpful, but library databases is, as well as journals list. So let's go here. And you can, of course, find a specific journal title if you want to search through here, but you can also use this to isolate journals by field. So I'm going to do literature because it's my field. And I have 497 journals on literature, including the Journal of Real Estate Literature, which is probably a little bit different from American literature or religion literature, both of which are very good journals. But it might give me a starting point. In the same way, I could put in chemistry education, and let's see if there's a journal on. There is. There are 6 journals on chemical education. How about that? If that's an area you're interested in, this could be a good place to start. To get to the databases, I've given you also these links in your research handout. These are databases by subject. So our math databases include MathSciNet, JSTOR, SpringerLink, ScienceDirect, and Wiley, as well as Archive. You probably heard about Archive if you are in STEM. Really great service for scholarly research, for scientific research. And so this might be a good place to start as well. If you happen to know the database name, you can also find it here in A to Z. So I know that in literature, the big database is called the Mla International Bibliography. So it just runs on EBSCO, I believe. Yeah, same thing there, but it has different search fields and, of course, indexes different information. So there's a lot you can do here. We have great librarians on staff. We're more than happy to help you. You can go to the Ask a Librarian tool right here. And I don't think, oh, they're available right now. Well, I don't want to bother them right here, but you can get the information there. There's an email link. You can always ask me if you're having trouble finding stuff. I'm on Research Ninja, and so I like doing this. But take some time to familiarize yourself with those resources and tools, and start looking for sources for paper 2. If you have trouble, if you're not sure if something is going to work, and if you hit a paywall, please let me know. I'm glad to help you with that. In the next lecture, I'm going to look more specifically at summarizing and synthesizing sources, because they're 2 major tasks you'll be doing in paper 2. And then we'll finish up with a separate lecture on showing the significance of your work. So I'll see you back here for part 9.